Hey, Council, I'd like to call this Committee of the Whole meeting for September 16, 2021 to order, and I will ask for adoption of the agenda. Someone want to make that motion? Councillor Brooks-Hill, seconded by Councillor Ryan. All in favor? Motion's carried. Moving on to adoption of the minutes of August 12, 2021. Someone want to make that motion for me? Councillor Ryan, seconded by Councillor Brooks-Hill. All in favor? Motion carried. Any business arising from those minutes? Seeing none, we are going to move on to announcements from the mayor. Just one announcement this week. I want to welcome our new CAO, James Thackray. He'll be starting with the city of Revelstoke on October 4th, and we're happy to have him on board. So we're looking forward to him joining our team. Going to move on to 7A, bylaws, development services, zoning bylaw, comprehensive review. So, Ms. Wade, I'll leave it with your department, please.
Thank you, Your Worship. Good afternoon, Council. Today, we have with us our consultant, Kevin Brooks from McElhaney, who's been working with us and been before you before at the last Committee of the Whole meeting. In regards to the zoning bylaw, and of course, Mr. Simon. The object of today's, we're calling it a workshop, is that we can move through the zoning bylaw that has been proposed and the amendments to it that we discussed in June and again in March, and has been posted on the Talk Revelstoke page and has been before the various committees of council, and has had a fair, robust engagement. Mr. Simon is driving the presentation for us today, so we have it in one place. So we can probably move forward, Paul. And so I've just briefly talked about the overview of the workshop. So the idea today is that we will go through the proposed amendments and stop and have a question and answer period so that you can ask your questions at each point of the proposed amendment. And we will also take some notes on that and make sure that we can get you that information back after the Committee of Whole today as well, just so you have a record of the discussion today. Then moving forward, the background, as I've said, is that we've already been to Committee of the Whole twice. We've been to APC twice. We've been to the Economic Development Commission. We have been supported along the way with the proposed amendments. Many of these amendments are minor amendments that the community has been looking for, and we're looking for from a clarification point of view, and they'll be quite helpful in helping us with our housing, and because a lot of these proposed amendments are critical to helping us do infill housing. So with that, I also wanted to just note too that we don't have this in the slide, but we did talk with our building community as well at our monthly meetings, so they are aware as well. And we did send out an email, I guess about 10 days ago, just to council to give them a heads up with all the information and if there was any questions that you had of us. So moving into our next slide, I'm going to turn it over to Paul Simon, who is going to address this side, and then he will turn it over to Kevin Brooks, and then we will go through with a step-by-step engagement process, and then I will summarize it at the end. Mr. Simon?
Thank you. So the first thing that we wanted to touch base with the committee on has to do with what we would refer to as the housekeeping amendments for the overall document. So no surprise, we've chatted about it in the past, but there's been some substantial revisions, and this was the first time that council was getting the whole bylaw in its nice, neat, tidy package. So you can see that there has been some changes to, general formatting. So some examples, you're looking at the zones themselves in terms of all the uses that are listed. They're now in a nice clean table rather than being kind of listed out individually. A lot of unnecessary, outdated references have been removed. References to unlawful delegations that remained from decades previous in the zoning bylaw have been taken out to align with provincial legislation. Regulations that were currently dispersed throughout the bylaw. So a really good example is our landscaping regulations and usable open space regulations that were dispersed throughout the zones themselves have been consolidated into supplementary regulations. This makes the document very, very easy for applicants as well as staff to navigate, to communicate exactly which policies are applicable where. Definitions and graphics have been used to ensure consistent interpretation, and we'll show you some examples of some of the graphics in a minute. But just some of the other things too that are they're minor, but they're actually very, very important. So we've been going on in previous meetings about definitions and how critical definitions are. So every single word that's in the bylaw that's defined is now italicized. So it's very, very clear for members of the public exactly what words are defined and where they go to see those definitions. This is very important when you're looking at interpretation and application of the regulations in the bylaw. So we're hoping that this will significantly improve the usability of the document, as well as make sure that everyone who's looking at it is interpreting something the same way. So here's some examples of some of the diagrams that are in the bylaw. So the one on the left here, just a very basic example of what the setback areas are for front yard, rear yard, side yards. Makes it abundantly clear, and you'd be surprised how often this question does come up. Exactly what is my front yard setback area? Does my side yard setback area overlap with it, or does it extend to each end of the property boundary? So this just provides a very, very clear image for people to understand what their building envelope is when we're talking setback regulations. The two on the right here have to do with height calculations. So again, this is another very, very common question that the development services group gets. How do you calculate height? And even when we point individuals in the direction of, well, here's the regulations and here's the definition of building height, it's still caused quite the amount of confusion at times. So we're hoping that with these diagrams, it'll make it very, very clear, and especially because we do have so many contractors and designers in town that are frequently going through the process. Now that we have established what that consistent interpretation is of building height, it'll be very, very clear, and it will streamline the review process for building permits when you're calculating height. That's just one example. There's many examples of how we've looked to do this with the bylaw to make it that much easier to administer and that much easier to implement. So I don't know if there's any questions from council on the overall formatting changes, overall kind of restructuring of the document. The whole intent has been to increase the accessibility of it for all stakeholders who use it. So we'll open it up to council right now, and if not, I'll pass it over to Kevin for the discussion on bylaw content.
Any questions, councillors? Councillor Palmer?
Just a comment. So we're at that sort of general level. I do have some questions about the setbacks and stuff. I think that comes a bit later on. But on the general, so we're talking about the ease of use of the new bylaw. It's about the same length though, correct? But so it's more of these sort of details. You were showing some of the illustrative things of the housing and the lot plans. That's where it becomes, because of the visuals, is that why we're saying it's an easier document to use?
Through the chair, the visuals are one example, cleaning up a lot of the language as well, where you're not changing the intent of regulations, but you're making the regulations easier to follow for the average person. One of the things with zoning bylaws, especially zoning bylaws that were written, in about the 80s or 90s, is the language that was used was definitely language that was written by planners. And so there's been a trend now to move towards more plain language for the regulations to achieve the same intent. So some examples are vision clearance regulations are one where we've cleaned up. Our fencing regulations are some where we've cleaned up, as well as our projections. So canopies, roof lines that are allowed to go into the minimum side yard and rear yard and front yard setbacks. We've cleaned up some of the language there so that it's written in a more plain, easily digestible manner. So that you're not altering the intent of what the regulation is, but you're making it easier to understand what the regulation is.
Oh, Councillor.
Yeah, I do have some other sort of questions that maybe we could go to a full display because it might be some of the others answering.
Sure. And then I'm going to go to Councillor Charlotte. You have a question? So can we get you to stop sharing the screen so we can see all of the people? And Councillor Charlotte.
Great, thank you, Your Worship. Yeah, this is great. I'm looking forward to the rest of the conversation as well as we dive into these different pieces. But just working with some large documents myself in work, I really appreciate the concept that if a word has a definition that we can refer to, it is indicated as such as an italicized word. I'm wondering if the team has considered using footnotes to support that as well. And the reason why I ask about footnotes is because with modern work typically happening online rather than in print, footnotes are often hyperlinks, so that when you're looking at something like, what is that word? And the little footnote is actually a button you can press to go to that definition and then be able to come back. So just for that usability part, I really appreciate the conversation around accessibility and making this more approachable for people.
Through the chair, that's a really good comment. And right now the document isn't set up that way, but we have had some discussions about, you know, further improvements to look at linking the document in and of itself. And when you have a regulation that, you know, those notwithstanding regulations that reference another policy, that would actually link back to it. And Kevin and Marianne may have something to add on to that. I know it is a standard practice, and that's something that we could look at doing for rolling out our consolidated digital version that would be available online.
Wonderful.
Yes, I agree, Paul. That's something that we do recommend regularly. When you PDF your consolidated version, the italicized words in that, you have them. So those are actually your links back to your definition. So you don't fundamentally need the footnotes. You actually make it so you actually can click on the word to actually jump throughout the document itself. Great.
Thank you. Councillor Palmer, back to you.
Yeah, so, Samir, I was just thinking about all the documents. Like, it's very commendable the number of things we're doing. So we're doing the vacation rental or short-term rentals. We've got the OCP happening. We've got the housing strategy and the zoning. And it was just occurring to me that I think it's amazing that the staff would be doing that volume of things, because these are all very, very substantive. But I was just a little bit concerned on both council and community fatigue. And I note in the, and maybe this isn't the right time for this dialogue, but like I note on the feedback, we're saying, okay, well, we've got a robust engagement, and yet there's, it's fairly minimal numbers of stuff that's typically controversial. And so it's just a concern. The zoning is the one that probably is the most urgent in some ways, because of conflicts of what we want as a community, and some of the stuff that Mr. Simons talked about, confusion within the bylaw and all the amendments and lack of definitions. And I think it's really important for us as well collectively as council, because we're trying to address these things like carriage house, like infill development. So these are really important. Yet I'm a little bit conflicted because we're addressing these other big controversial things, and even by virtue of not, it seems like the changes weren't flagged at access to those kind of things. So I just wonder if we're fatigued. I'll admit that there's another layer, because we're in UBCM right now as well. So another half hour or 20 minutes are going to be conflicted whether I stay here or elsewhere, and they're both important to me. So those are just some general comments. I almost want to, well, I kind of want to delay, but I don't want to delay on it at the same time. So that's just a general comment. And I don't know if in the report, the director's report, it talks about the timelines. And again, I applaud the ambitious timelines, but we have another public hearing that would be involved with this. And I think there was a date that was too ambitious. I'm not seeing it right now for a public hearing. I'm not sure when we're anticipating that. But again, we have these other things. So I don't know if there's some general comments from staff on those concerns, this volume, both from the staff perspective, community, and then council.
Ms. Wade, any comment?
Yes, Your Worship, through to Council Palmer. This has actually been in progress for almost 2 years. And it's a really critical piece, not only for staff, but for the community. We need to make these changes because of the age of this bylaw is significant and the amendments that have been done. And in order for us to address community concerns like infill housing and to provide better clarification on how we interpret height and setbacks, these changes, which will really help the community, and it will really help staff because it will help for consistent interpretation and ease of application. And this is just a document that is quite old and it needs to be cleaned up. And the next step of this will be to look at it in a more comprehensive manner once we get through the OCP. But this is a really critical tool for staff and for the community. And we have heard from the community and they're quite supportive over getting these amendments done so they'd have a user-friendly and we can move forward with infill. Right now, without these changes, we are creating situations that is not promoting infill, but in fact promoting single family. And so we need to really address those, and we will be talking about those major amendments as we move forward, but they're really critical to where we are in time. And we feel very confident in getting this forward. And as we talked about on Tuesday, we have the short-term rental. 2 weeks after that, we'll have the OCP 2297 and 2298. Then we'll move into this so that we can get these critical pieces that have really would be very helpful to the community and staff.
So, Ms. Wade, as far as engagement goes, you've already engaged the development community in this zoning bylaw, and they've weighed in on that in a positive manner. Is that correct?
That's correct. We have people are just saying, when is it going to happen? They want to get on with what their plans are, and they're all on hold. So it's really something people are very supportive of, and they understand the value of this.
All right, thank you. Any other questions, Councillor?
Just follow up. So approximately when do you anticipate, if things go well, the public hearing would be for the zoning bylaw? And I'm just trying to get these sort of pieces together. We have our short-term rental, or OC, short-term rental OCP. We've done the building thing already. And so when would you anticipate might be the earliest time for a public hearing? Based on because you have the phases in your report there, and I do have a question on that, but when would you anticipate the first public hearing?
So through your worship to Councillor Palmer, and I will defer to Ms. Floyd, but our understanding is we would roll it in behind the OCP amendment that we're anticipating 2 weeks after the short-term rental, and then we would roll this out. We're anticipating, if all goes well today, that we would like to bring this forward for first and second reading on the September, or October, where are we at now? September 28th meeting. So that's what we're anticipating right now. Ms. Floyd, I don't know if you'd like to step in.
Are you suggesting at the same time as the like piggybacking on the OCP, or would it be like a couple weeks later kind of thing?
Yes, a couple weeks later. Yeah.
Ms. Floyd?
To Councillor Palmer, through your worship, I agree with Ms. Wade. We could basically do it when you thought that the community would be ready for it, but we'd be happy to prepare for a public hearing 2 weeks after the OCP amendment.
All right, thank you. Any other questions or comments at this point? Seeing none, if we can carry on, please. Oh, Councillor Shalit, you have your hand up?
Yeah, I was just going to chime in a little bit on that as well, to Councillor Palmer's point about the fatigue and how much can we handle at once. I think one thing that makes me more confident on moving this forward and having this conversation now is incrementally in different pieces, but at the same season, is because they are all interlinked. It is one big conversation, and we are looking at the different avenues and the different policies and bylaws that affect how we organize our community between the OCP, the zoning, and the short-term rentals. I think it's an important conversation, and I'm hopeful that, yes, while we are all fatigued, I don't see that ending anytime soon, and this will hopefully make our lives a little bit easier going forward to be able to build some infill housing and solve some of this affordability issues. So just if that's helpful, Councillor Palmer.
Great. Thank you for that comment. All right, let's carry on, Ms. Wade.
So thank you, Your Worship. I'll pass it off to Mr. Brooks now, who will run through the major bylaw content changes, and we can have a discussion again after each, and I will take notes from everyone.
All right, thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Paul. Can everybody hear me fine?
Yes, thanks, Kevin.
Perfect. So we'll dive in to start with accessory dwelling units. And there's a couple comments from council that actually is a very good segue into the discussion in regard to ADUs. This topic really is a response directly to both what we've been hearing from the community through the OCP process and that, and also from council, dealing with the affordable housing crisis. Accessory dwelling units, or because I'm a planner, I like jargon, ADUs, are just one of those tools that allow for that multi-generational living, rental stock, providing mortgage helpers, and basically getting some additional stock, rental stock in the market. What we've been proposing is that to enable carriage suites, garden suites, and secondary suites, and provided clarity around these different kinds of units through amending the definitions for each of those, and updating the actual provisions within the bylaw to reflect what we're proposing in regards to where these units can occur and how the units can be sited on a property. Of course, we're happy to address any of the questions with regards to if you have specific questions around some of the details in regards to that. Like I said, the focus has really been on cleaning up the definitions and ensuring that people understand the fundamental differences between the various accessory dwelling unit types.
Okay. Councillor Elliott.
So the ADUs, we're going to apply those to any lot that's big enough. If it's currently R1, if there's space available, we'll encourage these type of developments. Is that what I gather?
Okay, any comment, Mr. Brooks?
So yes, the intent is to allow for carriage suites and garden suites on parcels that permit single family homes that are large enough to meet the actual setback requirements and siting requirements.
So it's still zoned R1, or is there some modification to the zoning?
No, we wouldn't, through your worship, we would not modify the zoning. The actual provisions for your ADUs would be added to the supplementary regulations that would then control how the ADUs are applied to the various unit types that allow for ADUs. The reason I say that because we treat secondary suites, which we'll get to next, slightly differently. And so you have your accessory dwelling units, carriage houses and garden suite. We also have secondary suites, which we treat slightly differently. And the way we've tweaked the regulation, and we can get into this in a moment, but the way we've tweaked the regulation there really reflects the modernization of the BC Building Code. And so we can speak to that in a moment of where we're proposing that secondary suites could also be integrated into the community beyond just single family homes.
Councillor Palmer.
Thank you to the chair. So thank you. This is one of the aspects within the zoning bylaw that I'm perhaps the most excited about is the opportunity of carriage suites and garden suites. And then also, and you said you're going to address secondary suites separately in a moment, but also the aspect of secondary suites and row houses. So I just wouldn't mind a little bit of dialogue on if you could give a snapshot on the difference between the carriage suites and the garden suites. I have looked at it, read through it, and I guess one of the fundamental questions that I have is the reason for two types of suites in that kind of, because they're very, very similar in many ways. And why the need to have the two distinct things, and what are the advantages as opposed to sort of blending those two into one kind of thing?
Mr. Brooks?
Through your worship, Councillor Palmer, thank you. Excellent question. And there is a fundamental difference between carriage suites and garden suites. And there's a different impact to neighborhood character that each of these have. A carriage suite has and is integrated with a garage, typically above a garage, where you have a garage on the bottom and a suite above it. That has a fundamental different massing, and the way that you site that on a lot will be different than a carriage suite, which is our garden suite, sorry, which is typically a single story unit without the garage underneath it. And so there's fundamental differences in regards to how that should be sited on a lot and how that could potentially impact character within a neighborhood. That's why we have two different definitions, and that's why we have two different provisions in the actual bylaw for supplementary regulation on how those are cited on a parcel.
And follow up to that. So I guess that's one of the things that I'm just sort of wondering. So typically with the carriage suite, like you say, it's got the garage below and then the dwelling unit above. That garage, correct me if I'm wrong on any of these assumptions, but the garage could be used by the principal building or by the carriage suite. So there's that flexibility within that. So it creates a ability of parking, some desirability, and then essentially having a smaller unit coming off the alley. And I guess one of the things I wonder about that is that kind of makes sense, and it's kind of the way municipalities have been going with carriage suites. But at the same time, I wonder if that's being more restrictive in comment, because I'm just kind of curious. Like, I think even in the definition you have, if I may go in the definition, anyway, something there's some qualifiers like typically, I think was in the definitions. I have some questions about that. And so, for talking about the carriage house specifically, and I believe you have parking or storage, so that's getting past this of somebody building a garage and then just using it for storage because that's what they wanted all along. Why not living space down there for either the principal building or for the carriage suite? Why not that provision? Is that something that would be left for a variance for a special circumstance? Obviously, there needs to be parking, but that would be, I think, would be within the requirements anyway to have appropriate parking for all the uses there. But I'm just, if there's a comment on that, because I'm just wondering if it's too restrictive.
Yeah. Through your worship, Councillor Palmer, that's an excellent question. And what you're asking is, should we be allowing for a full secondary dwelling permitted on a parcel? Because that's basically what, if you take a carriage suite and you turn the garage into living space, you're saying we should be able to have two houses on a parcel. So, that is something that the city could contemplate, but it's not something that's typical to permit. When you look at carriage suites, garden suites, secondary suites, there's a fundamental restriction on floor size to differentiate between the principal use and a subordinate use, right? A carriage suite as a subordinate use is a restriction in floor size, and you allow for parking or storage, and that can be used by either the person in the carriage suite or the principal residence. The garden suite itself, again, a restricted floor area, because the principal building, the principal residence in this case, has to be the principal use on the parcel with a secondary use to help support that principal use. If we were to then say, okay, what we're going to do is we're going to redefine carriage houses, and you can actually just build a two-story building basically as big as you want. What you're saying is we should be permitting two principal buildings on an R1 lot or a single family lot, which is something that the city can contemplate. That is not something we contemplate in the context of how we looked at providing additional, what we call invisible density or gentle densification for Revelstoke. As soon as you start putting a full secondary residence, it's not a secondary dwelling anymore, it's a secondary residence, you're fundamentally changing the character of the community, and you're fundamentally changing the character of neighborhoods. And that's not the intent of the proposals that we brought forward.
Yeah, just to follow up, thank you. And I think the approach that you have here, which is, I think, fairly typical, I would concur. It's still that question and how we transition and the expectations of the community and society. One of the things I did note on the carriage, again, speaking to what you just talked about, is the height. And so in my mind, the carriage house, in a way, I wouldn't mind seeing more flexibility in the lower level, but it does, the aesthetics needs to feel as it's important rather than two houses on a lot. And yet, in some ways, you have a large house and a smaller house. They are two houses, essentially. So, but anyway, one of the things that I noted in the zoning that I would prefer is that the carriage suite is lower, because it's up to can't exceed the principal building. To me, it should be just, even if it's just like a foot kind of thing, just a little bit. I don't know if other communities have done. I think some have required it to be a little bit less. That's so that it's avoiding that idea of two houses on the lot. Mm-hmm. So I think that's a comment.
Thank you for that comment.
Any other questions or comments, councillors? Let's carry on, Mr. Brooks, Mr. Simon.
So the next topic, secondary suites. So in a lot of the comments that we've currently talked about really apply to secondary suites also. The fundamental purpose, again, of secondary suites are the same for the other ADUs that we have spoken to. What we have done is we've updated the secondary suite definition to specifically include the fact that you could have them in single family, two family, and row housing residential units to make the secondary suites provision consistent with the modernization of the building code itself. That's the fundamental difference between what we're talking about with the other accessory dwellings that are fundamentally detached from a home, and a secondary suite, which is actually integrated into the dwelling unit itself. And of course, based on this, we've also upgraded the actual supplementary regulations to reflect these proposed changes.
Any questions on that, Councillor Elliott?
Yes, just on the secondary suite in an existing dwelling. What are the restrictions or requirements to meet building code? Do they have to be a totally isolated entity within the home?
Through your worship, yes, they do. The building code is very, very explicit with regards to secondary suites and how they're constructed. There's specific, I know I'm going to mess up the terminology and all my building inspector friends are going to make fun of me. I'm going to call it fire separation. I know it's not fire separation, but there's actually, you have to have basically fire separation on your roofs and a certain amount of burn time between a secondary suite. They need to be completely separate units with completely separate air handling, all of those different elements under the building code. And so there's very specific building code requirements for that.
So that's for a legal suite in an existing home.
That's correct.
So just historically, renting out a room in your basement, the majority of people do have a completely enclosed entity, or is that, what's your feel on how many illegal suites compared to illegal suites are in place? I mean, what's the norm?
I wouldn't be able to speak to the statistics in Revelstoke with regards to illegal versus legal suites. What you do find when you don't have provisions that are flexible in a zoning bylaw to allow for secondary suites, you're gonna have a lot of illegal ones. You also need a foundation to actually begin to bring illegal suites into compliance with regulation, right? And so if you don't have a flexible and transparent framework within your zoning bylaw, your building officials are going to have a really, really difficult time working with the community to try to transition your illegal suites to legal suites. And so what we've done here is I've made a proposal to make it consistent with the building code. And as Revelstoke grapples with illegal suites, is you're giving your bylaw enforcement people and your building inspection team the foundation on which to help people transition.
Yeah, it's a fine line there. I think to retrofit, a community that's got a glut of 80-year or 100-year-old houses to accommodate the rental shortage, we're in a difficult situation. I think most of the people converting those rooms or basements or whatever, we can make the majority of them legal. The gist of it, I think putting in a new furnace system or new air conditioning or a separate entity in an old house is a onerous endeavor. And if our bylaws go hard on forcing illegal suites, then I think we're going to have another problem on the rental situation in our town. So I don't know, we're in an awkward spot.
So the standard, Mr. Brooks, is what you're stating as far as legal secondary suites regarding the building bylaw is to be a fire safe entity as well as a separate air handling, correct?
To your worship, yes, and there are other provisions, but those are the provisions that I actually know reasonably well. But there are other provisions in the building code exactly how secondary suites need to be managed.
Good. Any other questions, Councilor Palmer?
Yes, I don't want to dominate. So just a few other things. So, and I'd just like to put a little backdrop because it doesn't necessarily, my colleagues don't necessarily agree with the philosophy, but the philosophy that I have on secondary suites, carriage houses, garden suites, is to allow the private sector to create affordable housing, so that more affordable housing in a community. So that's why I'm so supportive of this. If we had this a long time ago, I think we would have a lot better accommodation for those that have lower incomes, that they would be in better units, we would have less enforcement for illegal suites, less safety issues. And instead of using government money for big mega affordable housing projects, that this would allow the market and integrates affordability within the community. So that's my own philosophy, and people will agree or disagree to varying levels. I state that because of just these other questions. So, and again, they're just questions and trying to understand. So one of the things with the carriage suites and with the garden suites, it's specific that it can't be on a lot that has secondary suites. So as soon as you have a secondary suite, then you are excluding yourself from that ability. And I have, I guess, concerns about that, and I'll know there'll be some pros and cons, and one of the things is, okay, when do you get too much? When is an R1 house now looking like a fourplex or four units? So I understand that, but there can be ways to keep those minimal, but at the same time allow a higher densification. And I think it's an important question for us because there's a lot of single family houses with the illegal suites that essentially are becoming that. So there's multiple families in those settings. And so as an example, you could have a single family house on a large lot that has a secondary suite that is non-intrusive into the resident in its area, the neighborhood, and that a carriage house would still make sense. And so I just we'd like to hear from your perspective or staff, why that exclusion. Is that something that we consider of not having that exclusion? Maybe it complicates matters, but again, one of the things that in that particular example is that we're creating another affordable unit. So that, I guess that's the question that I have there, if you have any comments on that.
Okay, Mr. Brooks.
Yeah, through your worship, another excellent question. And there are different options that you could potentially look at for this city to look at that. One of the things, and it's always an issue with any kind of accessory dwelling unit, is how do you deal with the impact? And the primary impact that you typically are dealing with is parking and traffic. Your secondary impacts are going to be servicing, right? At what point is the parking, traffic impact, and your servicing impact for a typical single family lot, at what point is it too much intensity on what is it you originally intended for a single family lot? So there's different ways of dealing with that. One of the ways of dealing with that is, say, if you want a secondary suite and a carriage or garden suite, you have to have a really large lot to be able to facilitate it. But that kind of shoots ourselves in the foot with what we've done in other aspects of the bylaw, which we'll speak to later, where we're looking at removing certain areas of minimum lot size and stuff like that to allow for smaller lots to occur and things of that nature, right? Because the reality is yes, you need rental housing, but you're also going to need other forms of housing too. So the provisions that we put forward are dealing with the thing that we're talking about right now, are dealing with one aspect of that housing continuum, that rental housing stock that allows people, maybe mortgage helpers or multi-generational living and things of that nature. We've done other things in the zoning bylaw also to look at trying to allow for additional forms of housing. These provisions were specifically chosen the way that we've designed them, looking at the entire bylaw, not just one aspect of the bylaw. It's not that you can't contemplate, maybe as part of the comprehensive review, looking at, okay, maybe we should allow for secondary suites and carriage houses, singles with secondary and carriage houses. However, it's a much broader discussion of lot size and how the servicing, parking, and traffic management would then occur, which we did not do in detail as part of this review.
Just a quick follow-up through to the director. Is that a question that's, then that question that I just had, is that something that's better for a future phase? Because we're talking about phase one right now in your report. So this would be as something, this is very substantive of this change in itself without the suggestions that I'm making there. But that would be something that we would address in the future and with a possible amendment to the zoning bylaw at a future date.
Ms. Wade?
Yep, through your worship to Council Palmer, yes, this is just the first stage of hearing what we've heard in the community and fixing a problem we know. And then what we're going to do as we move forward is we're going to embark on our OCP. We know we have a population projection and what is our land use pattern going to be in a community conversation on that. And we also are just getting in our results with our housing inventory analysis and starting to get the targets and the gaps. So the conversation in the future, as we go through amending our zoning bylaw, we'll consider what we're going to discuss through the OCP and the housing action plan. So you're going to start seeing those pieces come in behind this, and then that will inform the amendments to the residential sections of the zoning bylaw.
Follow-up, Councillor Brooks.
I think Councillor Palmer raises a good point on this exclusion for carriage houses and garden suites if there's an existing secondary suite, because obviously no one knows how many illegal secondary suites there are in town, but we all know it's far more than the legal secondary suites, whatever that number is. I think Ms. Wade told us at some point it was really small. So the illegal ones, there's hundreds of them.
Right.
And really, I think I don't see it as a priority necessarily, but it's something we should be looking at, is how to bring those illegal suites into compliance, and for at least fire and safety, and also potentially for increasing our tax base. But this exclusion is just another barrier for people who have illegal suites. It's like, why would you legalize it? It's just another thing that's limiting you. You know, if you want to build a garden suite, well, if I have a legal secondary suite, I can't, so why would I legalize my suite? So I don't, it's a tricky question for sure, because when it's too much on a lot, is an obvious problem that neighborhoods are definitely going to be facing. But I don't know. I don't have an answer. I think it's definitely something worth discussing.
And I think Mr. Brooks has a point. We talk about traffic management, and I just see it in my own neighborhood and these sorts of things. But I can use my own home as an example. My home is big enough where I could put in a separate entrance. I could put in a secondary suite. I have a very large garage. I can knock the roof off, and I could put in a carriage house. I have enough room for parking and that sort of thing. So all those things could be done. But if all of a sudden we take one or two of those residents living in that house, should that ever come to pass and they're all parking on the street, then it becomes a problem. And I think that's the biggest issue when we exceed our capacity. So my building, taking up extra space on my lot now would exceed what I'm allowed to do. However, if we were to build up, so we look at all those things, and so you both have good examples of what we can and what we can't do and what we should exclude or not exclude. So those are things that we need to have a conversation on this moving forward. So I think Mr. Brooks has nailed it as far as traffic and placement of vehicles. Councillor Elliott.
Just on the traffic, I've been constantly asking for an update on the traffic plan, the transportation plan, and methods to reduce our traffic, reduce our parking, and reduce our our footprint on a community. And that's plays into part of the zoning. So we're zoning for, you're worried about parking restrictions. I'm saying get rid of freaking cars. Sorry.
That makes total sense, but you can't enforce that on someone that say has to drive for work.
We have our transportation plan plays into this, right? I mean, if we're putting a zone in place we had a debate about a fourplex, and parking was going to be an issue. And I said, well, we're going electric. We're trying to get transportation minimized. Why is it a problem? So I think we need to build flexibility into this so that we can change or adapt to whatever transportation feature that unfolds. We just need some amenability built into it.
Yeah, okay. Makes sense. Councillor Palmer?
Thank you. So just a couple comments. First, I'm just going to preface that I'm should be in a policy session on forest practices right now that I would really like to be, because it affects our community, but this is really, really important too, so this is going to win out. Just a note on the parking, so we get to the parking on the densification again. I think it's for future phases, but to me, I would rather have a parking enforcement problem, because they're going to be required to have adequate parking, rather than an illegal suite problem. Right. So that, so I would, when you have our illegal suites or fire traps, there's a whole host of problems around illegal suites. So and we already have the parking problems associated with the illegal suites. We see them on just about every residential street.
Yep.
And I think this is my last question, I think, on this, is the setbacks. So you talk specifically within, at this level, and then later on in the zoning bylaw on setbacks. And of course, we're going to be talking a little bit later on greenhouses and that kind of thing in the front yard setback. But on the setbacks here, both for the carriage houses and the garden suites, that the setbacks, the side and rear setbacks need to be in reference to the corner lot. I'm questioning whether now is the time to readdress the setbacks. And the reason for that question is we are doing a lot of variances on setbacks. Sometimes they're asked for forgiveness kind of setbacks, other times they're administrative errors, sometimes it just makes sense. And as we're evolving into a society that is more accepting of a narrower setback, should we be addressing that at this time? Even if it was just incremental, is that something that we want to talk about? We could leave it for another phase, but in my mind, when we have, especially in the urban core, where the older houses already have a very tight setback, so there's already that sort of ambience in the community. So why, instead of going through a variance process, why don't we allow, make those setbacks smaller? Because we're encroaching on that. So it's just a general comment. In a way, I would like to see that addressed without getting it as an item that sort of delays moving this one, the zoning bylaw ahead.
Any comments on that, Mr. Brooks? What are we looking at for standard setback for rear yard setback and side setback at present? Is it 3 meters from the rear and 2.5 or something from the side, or is that totally different?
I apologize. I can't remember off the top of my head what a standard R1 zone setback is. For the proposed carriage house and garden suite setback, we are proposing a 1.5 meter setback from rear and side. That 1.5 meter setback is based on your limiting distance in your BC building code. Once you get under 10 feet between face of building to face of building, it actually increases the actual construction requirements of those buildings, which can significantly increase the cost of construction. And so that 1.5 meter setback is based on that limiting distance factor in your the BC building code. And so that's why that number you see in the provisions that we provided for both carriage suites and garden suites.
And that actually, when we look at that, I think Mr. Palmer, you can weigh in from your perspective, but when I look at 1.5 meters from rear yard setback, that's actually very close to the limit, and that looks like we're actually putting them in the back corner away from the other residential entities so that it's safer for everyone. So, any comment?
Yeah, from my perspective, yeah, I understand that the fire it's basically fire contagion or fire, I guess. And so that the building code, if the setbacks are smaller, the building code's going to look after that matter. And so somebody's going to have a choice on go 1.5 meters or whatever it is in the building code, or go closer and then have basically more robust siding, hardy plank or whatever for fire. So to me, I don't see that as a reason to limit it within the zoning. I think it's more about the sort of community issues. And again, I'll remind council, we have permitted by variance and may be questionable on the building code from council. But anyway, I think that's a comment for staff to take a look at. We won't belabor that anymore.
Good. Councilor Brooks, you have your hand up?
I put it down, sorry.
Okay, Councilor Charlotte.
Thank you, Your Worship. And just further that, I'd agree with it. Having so many variances come forward is definitely a burden to a certain extent. But at the same time, I appreciate the opportunity for a neighbor to weigh in on this kind of a conversation, because in most of the cases, when we're talking about reducing the setback, the buildings have already been built. So that it is easier to make that choice. Because if you build closer to the edge of your lot, then that does have an implication on your neighbor if it drives up their cost to build as well. So having seen some structure fires in the community recently, and the fact that our firefighters were able to keep those fires to one building and it did not spread in our neighborhood, I really appreciate. And it's really got me thinking about the safety concerns and that question when it comes to buildings. And while I respect the fact that the building code would step in and make those requirements necessary, I'm just concerned that that would have an implication potentially on the neighbor, that a variance would give that neighbor an opportunity to weigh in on the conversation, where if it was according to zoning, then they might not. And I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, if they would still have an opportunity there. But this is where I think zoning bylaws can help mitigate those issues.
Councillor Elliott?
So currently, the R1 setbacks for front and backyard are 6 meters. These are side yard setbacks we're talking about right now.
6.3, 1.5, 1.5.
On the sides. Yeah. Okay, so that's the proximity to your nearest. So we're talking about the carriage house now being able to get to the 1.5 meter. To your new. Yeah. So,
Right. Okay, sounds good. And so if I could, Your Worship, I would say, like, as long as we're not getting anywhere near that 1.5, then any other conversation around setbacks really does come to character of the neighborhood, really, more than anything else, I would imagine. In which case, yeah, that would be a great thing to talk about, probably in a future phase of the zoning bylaw conversation, because it sounds like that's more of a character of the neighborhood conversation that should have some really robust community engagement.
Thank you. Any further comment, Mr. Brooks or Ms. Wade, before we move on?
Yeah, I'd like to, through your worship, like to say, yeah, that's a very accurate assessment. Say someone came in and varied or had a 1 meter setback and built a building at 1 meter off the property. The next door neighbor then could be unintentionally penalized, because now if they want to build, their construction standard automatically is going to go up even if they build at 1.5 meters. And so I think that's a very accurate statement that the 1.5 treats neighbors equitable. Everybody's going to be in the same place. Then if they request a variance, then at least people can talk about what the potential impacts are on their neighbor from reducing that to 1.5 to less than that.
Okay, appreciate that comment. All right, let's move along, please.
So the next item we have is parking. So our review of the parking really was to focus on overall consistency in the bylaw. What we've seen throughout the bylaw is a really inconsistency that there's parking regulations embedded in zones. The way the parking regulation was written there is based really on sort of zoning designations and not uses specifically. And we also looked at providing some greater flexibility in regards to cash and lieu options and some options for promoting basically biking and walkability of developments. With regards to specific items that we looked at, we went through the entire parking thing and we made sure that for each use, there's an allocated parking provision to a use. We've also made sure that the uses that are actually listed in your parking regulations, there's actually definitions for. I know those sound like little things, but from an administration perspective, the existing parking regulations are very, very challenging. And what we did is clean those up to allow for administration. As for the components to look for greater flexibility, the cash and lieu provisions we cleaned up. There is some, unlawful delegation components that are associated with that. So we provided to clean that up. And the additional regulations really looking at around how we could look at allowing sort of reduction in parking when in proximity to a bus stop or when bike stalls and things of that nature were provided for different forms of multifamily housing.
Okay, thank you. Any questions? Councilor Palmer?
Can you just give a perspective or give what the changes are for the cash and lieu, because that's been a sort of a sticky issue for quite a while, and I'll have to go online and have a Green Party sticker, but sorry. The cash and lieu, what the problem was and what you've done to mitigate those problems. I just question the whole concept of cash and lieu for parking.
Yeah, so I'll give the sort of the high level, and then I'm going to have to rely on Mr. Simon a little bit if he could pull up the zoning bylaw so we have the exact wording to show you. Cash and lieu is a specific tool for local governments in situations where you want certain forms of development to occur, but they may not be able to achieve their parking in some way, shape, or form. Perfect example typically is higher density developments. They want to use a larger area of the property. They can't facilitate underground. And then they can pay cash in lieu for parking that then the town can utilize for building up parking somewhere else in the community to offset the potential parking requirements. With regards to what we did with the cash in lieu stuff, is we basically cleaned it up so it's not just specific to the C1 and C2 districts, that we provide that parking cash in lieu ability to occur in other areas.
Clear? Any comments?
And so what, in the new bylaw, what's the section with the cash in lieu? Where's it found? Do you know?
I don't actually have my bylaw up on my computer. I'm actually working off my small laptop at home. Would you be able to provide that, Paul?
Simon, do you have that in front of you?
To your worship, here's the section 13.3. It should be on the screen for everyone to see now. So you can see it is in sections 13.35, and the reference is right here in section 13.33.
Okay, thank you.
All right, good, thank you. Any other comments or questions regarding parking?
So the parking in lieu fees that we charge, is there a set amount for if they're short of parking stall?
Set fee regarding parking this way?
Yeah, through your worship, to Councillor Elliott, yes, there is, and it's laid out in the fees and charges bylaw.
To your worship, it's $20,400 per stall.
Thank you, appreciate that. Nice round figure.
And, you know, bit of the issue with that is it competitive? Is it reflective? How did we get to that number?
Okay. Is there a comment regarding that, Mr. Simon, as to how we attained that number?
Your worship,
Other communities, etc. I'll let you weigh in and then I'll ask the question further.
To your worship, and Ms. Wade may have some to add into this. I know that was updated, I believe, from $500 per parking stall a number of years ago, and it was based on an analysis of other municipalities and resort municipalities. You know, the top one being, I believe, Whistler at $40,000 per parking stall. So they had projected something that would kind of fall within the middle. I do want to note, though, that is something that's in the fees and charges bylaw. So the whole discussion of the zoning bylaw was to take it out from being only applicable to the C1, C2 zones, get rid of the unlawful delegations, include a little bit more regulation surrounding how we collect that cash in lieu and the provisions for parking stalls, and make the zoning bylaw a little bit more flexible so that that option is there and it's provided in line with the provincial legislation.
Great, and I appreciate that comment on that. I'm going to just see if there is I'll just go down that rabbit hole just a bit if we know the history on that sort of thing. And further to that, I'll ask if any other councillors want to weigh in just regarding those fees. Any comments?
Well, I do have some concern. Yes, you know, if it influences our development on our downtown core, I don't think any business in the downtown core has parking, or if they have one, or wouldn't meet today's requirements. So we should be evaluating where's parking. Like a Modern doesn't have parking, and I say, you might have a stall or two, but I think if we want to encourage development in our downtown core or the immediate area, we should be sensitive to the fact that parking is going to be an obstacle for new development.
And I think the next time we talk about fees and charges bylaw, that may be something that we need to have weigh in on.
And I'd also say that maybe we should update that comparison list. If Worcester was dictated at 40,000, maybe their demand where they have 2 million people banging at the door to get into the town is different than Russellville.
Yeah. So that's fine. Councillor Palmer, you had your hand up, and so I'm going to go to Mr. Simon and Ms. Wade first, and then back to Councillor Palmer.
To your worship, I'll let Ms. Wade go first, and then I can add on any of the little nuanced details of the zoning bylaw of how we've tried to improve parking.
All right, thank you.
So I'll separate out these two things. One, the table of cost comparisons can definitely be looked at and updated. I will suspect that it's probably even higher now given the cost of construction. So I would suspect those, when we start looking across municipalities, we'll see something higher than 20,000. So I just throw that one out. The other thing is with cash in lieu, one of the reasons for it is so that you can do infill, and also that you can promote in areas that are tight, the ability to gain density and offset it with the cash in lieu. It's a very highly used development tool, and particularly in areas like our downtown area. The other thing with that is that the parameters of when cash in lieu, how cash in lieu can be met. For example, in the OCP, which is something that we've been dealing with and will move forward with, is that, you know, there's walking distances where we can, that cash in lieu can be used, and, you know, there's ways of using transit stops and stuff. So we wanted to clarify how these policies were tied to a certain zone, how we could bring it into the parking section, and how it could be used as more of a tool when these situations arrive, so people have choices. So, Mr. Simon, did you want to add in from there?
Yeah, and to your worship, through to Councillor Elliott, your concerns regarding the impact within the downtown area, specifically in the overall parking requirements, are well understood, and that's why as part of the parking amendments, what staff have proposed for council consideration is that for multifamily buildings and mixed-use buildings that have a walkability factor that Ms. Wade was referring to, there would actually be reduced parking requirements, and it would be reduced as much as one stall per unit. For example, for a suite, it would be half a stall per unit rather than 1.5 stalls per unit. And in addition, there are other little areas that staff have proposed changes to further reflect the reality of actual parking requirements on site. So an example is when you're looking at new development, so if there's a new restaurant downtown, sometimes it's based off of the gross area of that building that generates the parking requirement. Instead of using the gross floor area of the building, we're now proposing to use what we call the usable floor space of the building. So instead of the measurements being from the outside of the walls, including basements and everything, it would be based on the actual usable floor space. And that's something we've heard from the community. And that's an easy fix that we can put into the bylaw to lessen the burden for new development as it's coming in, especially within our downtown area. So there are these little nuanced changes that people usually don't recognize until they're going through the process and it generates issues for them. And we've heard from the community, and we've reflected that in these zoning bylaw changes. So that's some of the technical nitty-gritty.
All right, thank you, Mr. Simon. Ms. Wade. Councillor Palmer, you have a comment or a question?
Yeah, just some comments further to that in the spirit of the workshop, and that staff are taking notes for future consideration. So on the parking thing, I'm going to make contradictory statements, and the contradiction is, one, I would support, as I think the director indicated, that probably the requirements for funds in lieu are going to go up. At the same time, and again, I think Mr. Simon alluded to it with his idea of reality of parking requirements, I think was your phrase, is that we should be looking for opportunities to reduce the parking requirement where it doesn't make sense. And then, so specifically is on how are we innovative on reducing parking need as a community? And that's the idea of walkability, using bikes. There's the big boom in e-bikes that are essentially now starting to be a replacement for some motor vehicle activity. And so, and then of course we're putting all this money aside from the parking in lieu for future whatever. What is our plan? And could some of those things be on how we reduce the societal need for parking? So like the coffee shop example, maybe it's requiring more alternate transportation mode facilities, or if you have I think there was one a couple of years ago, a bike shop was struggling with parking stalls for cars, whereas maybe intuitively it would have made more sense to say, do bike parking stalls, and, do 3 of those in lieu of a parking stall. So those are some of the ideas there that put it in for the notes. The other is, what does our future look like in parking as we transition as a society? And maybe it's too futuristic, but when we start looking at autonomous vehicles, where the need to have private ownership of vehicles, instead there's a fleet that's going around picking people up, that we no longer have that need. And yeah, that's futuristic possibly, but that technology's all there. It would make way more sense than having a bunch of vehicles all over the place that are just sitting where there's a more shared community. So those are just some of the ideas that you can consider. Probably wouldn't be, most of that wouldn't be adopted in a new zoning bylaw at this time. Some of it could be.
All right, appreciate those comments. Let's move along if we can.
Thanks, Paul. So the next is food security, and we, again, like all these issues, we have presented this previously. As you all know, food security is becoming an increasing concern right around British Columbia. And so these provisions really are to propose different solutions to how to promote urban food. Part of it through permitting it in all zones, amendments to enable greenhouses in the front yards, and different amendments to the home-based business to allow for minor agricultural uses as a home-based business within the community itself. With regards to the permitting greenhouses in the front yards, we went over that in detail in our previous presentation. I believe it was back in June, just illustrating some of the provisions on how those greenhouses could be sited in the front yard. And the primary reason for that would be in those situations to enable for solar access. There's going to be some situations where putting a greenhouse in the backyard won't enable people to actually grow food. So that's the primary provisions that we're looking at. We'd be, again, happy to have some discussion on this one also.
Any comments, questions regarding greenhouse in your front lawn? Councillor Aller?
I'm all for gardening and growing your own food and having it, but most of the greenhouses I've seen are not pretty. And they're usually made up of leftover glass or stuff you can scrounge from wherever to build a greenhouse. So we're opening the door for bylaw enforcement. Are they aesthetically pleasing for the neighborhood? Are they an eyesore? Then we create an enforcement issue. So it's it's a tricky one to get into, but it's all discretionary, right? What's nice? What's nice from your perspective may not be nice for me. So it's an awkward spot again.
Yeah, appreciate the comment. Any other comments, councillors?
Tim, your greenhouse is pretty nice.
I have a really nice looking greenhouse in my yard. I thank you to staff and for addressing this issue, because I think it's important as we transition as a society. It's kind of interesting. Urbanization 100 years ago was getting away from food, and I think possibly my front yard garden is in contravention of some unsightly bylaw stuff. Of course, all my neighbors are in the same boat. And that's one comment on unsightly premise. I think with the grass can't be more than 4 inches or something like that. What's the aesthetics of a messy garden compared to the idea of the 1950s of a manicured lawn? One of the things I noted with the greenhouse is in the definition. I won't go there right now, but it just said made of glass, and I think Councillor Elliott's comment is you're going to have the used windows, these things that are kind of ugly and collapsing, and yet they're going to be under the square footage, the 10 square meters or whatever. that doesn't need to go through any kind of regulatory process for approval. So I think that's maybe something for staff to take a look at, anticipating those problems. Maybe a harder look at what that definition is. The other is, you alluded to it on the home business use. And I didn't note that in the definition as the home business use. One of the things that you can't do is have anything that indicates that there's a home business. You can't have a sign, you can't have anything in your garage, you can't store anything that's explicit in the new bylaw, I believe, and probably in the old one. So if we have, basically a market garden in somebody's front yard, is there a contradiction of what's happening in some of those definitions? Again, that's just a note for something for you to take a look at.
Okay, thank you. Any comments from any other councillors? Seeing none, any comments from staff regarding those comments?
Nope.
Good, all right, let's move on, thank you.
Our next item is parking and storage. This is again really speaks to a very common challenge in every community I work in throughout Western Canada, and it's really where do we put our boats, our RVs, and the various toys that we have, and how do we do it in a manner that it reduces the impact on neighborhood character as much as possible. One of the primary purposes of this provision is to provide some framework around how people can park these different recreational vehicles, boats, and things on their property, but also provide some provisions to assist bylaw enforcement with these issues, because they are challenging issues for bylaw enforcement and they're challenging issues for neighborhoods. So we brought forward allowances for how recreational vehicles are stored either in the front or rear yard, and basically regulations around how commercial vehicles and things of that can be stored on a private property.
Any comments, questions? Councillor Palmer, you have a question?
Thank you again for addressing this. It's a big thing in our community. We got motor homes, boats all over the place. Summertime, there's a lot of on-street parking. It's technically illegal. It's all over the place. I'm not sure how much BYLAWS is trying to enforce it, or if it's just complaint-based. So it's an interesting kind of thing, because we have a lot of that, including illegal accommodation that's happening on city property quite extensively. So you're talking about the limitation of one vehicle. Does this bylaw, does it deal with the essentially the illegal accommodation? So it's one thing to have your parents come and stay in their motorhome in your driveway for a weekend or something, compared to somebody that's renting out an RV for the summer kind of thing, or winter in some cases. Any sort of comments on how that's going to be addressed? And then the other thing is, because council, we talked about an enforcement issue that is not being enforced. I just realized it was in camera. So we can put these bylaws, but then what's the intent on enforcement, and will we have the fortitude to actually enforce it?
Through your worship, I can address Councillor Palmer's initial question with regards to people using fundamentally recreational vehicles as an accessory dwelling unit. And so even though we don't specifically talk to that in the bylaw itself, we do provide very clear definitions of what a dwelling unit is, what an accessory dwelling unit is, and how that looks on a parcel. It automatically excludes the use of recreational vehicles for that purpose, which means that it gives the foundation for bylaw enforcement to use more than just a building bylaw or things of that for enforcement. It now gives them the ability to use the zoning bylaw also as a tool of enforcement to ensure people are not living permanent residents inside a recreational vehicle on a private property.
Just for clarity, so technically, if mom and dad come and stay in their RV in our driveway for the weekend, technically they're breaking the bylaw, I believe, from the letter of the law. I'm not saying from an enforcement perspective.
Mr. Simon?
To your worship, through to Councillor Palmer, one of the challenges that we have right now is that we have no definition of recreational vehicle in our zoning bylaw. So to go and tell someone that they're contravening the zoning bylaw without having a definition in there of what an RV is and saying that it can't be used for permanent accommodation, that's a challenge. So what we've done with the zoning bylaw update here is that the definition of recreational vehicle is actually included, and it clarifies that it's only for temporary accommodation as a means of travel, right? So this might, provide some clarification for our bylaw if someone was out there for a weekend, compared to if someone's living on a larger lot in an RV for months on end, so that there's actually some mechanism for them to point to say you are exceeding what is anticipated as part of this use as an RV. It is not intended to be for permanent accommodation. And that's the biggest challenge that most municipalities do have when it comes to parking of RVs and other similar vehicles on a property. So this will help provide clarification compared to what we have right now, which is nothing in our bylaw.
So then in the new bylaw, just because I think it's of interest, so when mom and dad come for the weekend, that will be under the new bylaw, there'll be clarity that would be permitted. And then there's going to be some line, or is it more interpretation of intent?
Through your worship, if I may address that one, I would leave that as an interpretation of intent. The reason so, as soon as you get down that slippery slope of trying to define, visitors coming to that provision, those types of provisions can be misused. And so in situations like recreational vehicles and the use of that, they're very challenging to enforce. I recommend you try to be as black and white in your bylaw as possible, and then deal with situations like mom and dad coming to visit on a case-by-case basis, because the majority of the time, mom and dad coming to visit aren't driving bylaw complaints, right? And so that's what your team at the city needs to administer, is those bylaw complaints. And so, like I said, my recommendation: keep it as black and white as possible. Don't go through the slippery slope of trying to regulate everything with regards to the recreational vehicle in that context, because of the challenges with administration.
Thank you for that clarity. Any other comments, councillors?
Just if I could, I know it's great to get all the bylaws, but we've just acquired a bylaw enforcement officer 4 or 5 years ago. We're just adding more things that they're going to enforce. I don't know if we're going to need more bylaw enforcers.
Well, we will need when we start dealing with short-term rentals. And
short-term rentals, unsightly greenhouses, or RVs that are parked. We're going to add more things that they're going to have to jump on if we're detouring from the bylaw, and it just obviously going to need more bylaw enforcers. And I'm worried about I don't want a police state, Gary.
No, I don't think any of us do.
Police state is not where we're going.
And so it comes down to, as Mr. Brooks was saying, we want our bylaws to be black and white, so it's easy if it needs to be enforced. But we also want to give the benefit of the doubt to the community and say, you need to build a greenhouse, do it so that it looks at least aesthetically pleasing, or put it in your backyard.
It's not a chicken coop.
Yeah.
Come on.
Exactly. Right.
Okay. So,
all right. Go ahead.
Just in response to Councillor Elliott, staff have already indicated through the short-term rentals that the anticipation is for more bylaw enforcement officers, and there's going to be a price tag that comes to the taxpayer.
Exactly.
I think it's already grown in recent years, the bylaw enforcement and how that's going, but there is that dilemma of taxation and chasing things that don't make sense versus creating a community that we're all proud of, and not having broken glass greenhouses in your front yard, as using your example. So I'm struggling with that thing too, because but at the same time, we've had zoning bylaw for a long time and really enforced it, and then we create these other conflicts in communities.
No, I'm just throwing that out there, just be wary that we don't want this reputation as a black and white, by the book, and everybody's got rules for everything. And I say, wow, how do we get there?
Well, I think nobody wants to live in that situation.
Yeah, and I think we're a community that's welcoming and reasonable. That would be a better approach.
Yeah. All right, let's move on.
So our next topic is density bonusing. And so the density bonusing, there's existing density bonusing provisions in the zoning bylaw. They are embedded in the actual commercial zones, the C1 and C2 commercial zones. What we have done is we've actually pulled the density bonusing out of the actual zones, and we've actually put it into supplementary regulations. We've also actually made it more flexible to actually apply to a multitude of zones versus just the commercial zones themselves, to allow for density bonusing for other multifamily forms of housing and things of that nature. These revisions really are focused on creating greater flexibility, but also addressing the fundamental need. The reality is to reduce comprehensive development zones. The Revelstoke zoning bylaw, the way it is right now, has probably some of the most comprehensive development zones I've ever seen in a single zoning bylaw for such a small city. And so these provisions and a lot of their other provisions really are trying to look at ways to provide flexibility so you're not getting just a ton of comprehensive development zones for each new development that comes into the community. This gives you an example, just gives you the example of the existing bylaw, how they're embedded in the actual zone themselves, and the actual density provisions that we're proposing that provides that greater flexibility and that broader range of density bonusing for various uses, including various forms of multifamily, commercial, throughout your community.
Questions? Comments?
Thank you for addressing it, and thank you for your comments regarding the comprehensive development zones. And I think that's something that some of my colleagues we've had dialogues on the number of CD zones that we have, and do they really make sense, where probably we should have appropriate zoning rather than it's like our whole town is CD zones. So that's something moving ahead. I mean, we have what we have today as far as CD zones, but so the comment on the graphic that you had just now, because it's a visual, so with all those apartment building looking kind of things in there. So it just reminds me of 1950s, downtown Vancouver, bulk massing with no sort of sense of community space and view corridors. And so I really don't like that graphic because it's conveying something that feels very old school. And specifically when we start talking about bonus density bonuses, bonus density, in my mind, that it's really more about allowing greater height where it makes sense, and where it creates more of an ambience or a feel in our communities and neighborhoods that is just a better experience. And although we're not at all like Vancouver, but if we use Vancouver as sort of one of those examples, again, it's not apples and oranges, I recognize that, but that whole idea how you can go into urban Vancouver, have view corridors to mountains or reflective glass that's shining the sun back into the street and stuff. In the proposed bylaw, we're tying it more to affordable housing. And to me, I'm not, we need to encourage, holistic, affordable housing, but density bonusing and going to affordable housing. I see there's a definition. I didn't read the definition, but I think we really should be looking at how our neighborhoods feel, how our community feels, in whether that's affordable or not affordable. So just allowing, big, ugly, bulk massing buildings because it's portable housing is a ghettoization of our neighborhoods rather than an inclusivity. So those are my thoughts on that. I have some reticence on the way it's worded.
All right, thank you for that. Councillor Shaw.
Thank you, Your Worship. And yeah, that opens up a whole conversation there too, but hopefully we'll see that come forward as we go. I really appreciated the amenities that were listed in that, the density bonusing descriptions. My question though has to do with the CD zones, and I'm curious because we do have so many CD zones. Is this something where as we go forward long term, we might be able to get those CD zones brought back into the fold if we made that opportunity to get more of a regular zoning, or is that completely off topic, not related at all?
Would you like me to address that one, Marianne?
Marianne, do you want to weigh in?
Yeah, I'll let Mr. Brooks go first, and then I'll weigh in because we've discussed this one.
So the reality is the CD zones is a very complex issue because each zone is so specific. I did begin looking at them in the context of where those similarities lie, and because there's like 20 of them, it's unbelievably challenging. So the likelihood of being able to create sort of even groups of zones out of the CD zones is highly unlikely. It's possible, but it's going to it is be very, very complex task to do so. To go from what you're at now, just because if the CD zones that you do have are so site specific and the provisions are wildly different in each zone. So.
Right, because and those were created through negotiations at the time, I imagine.
Yes, exactly.
Ms. White.
Yep, I'm twofold here, but I'll just dovetail a little bit on Mr. Brooks. Yeah, part of the issues with the CD zones we're facing here is because there wasn't uses in a lot of our zones or not flexible in our zones. The CD zones were used to address that. And so part of the exercise we're doing here is trying to find flexibility, getting the definitions in and citing and parcel sizes so that we can actually avoid using CD zones specifically for that. And also, and then also to like variances, like how do we avoid variances as well? So a lot of the issues that we're cleaning up in this is because of what we've seen with the CD zones and the variances as well. And then the other thing in relation to this density bonusing is that it was written into a zone. There was policies in the OCP. It's old language, lead versus step, things like that. So what we did is just say, okay, here's the intent of these bonusing that was written into C1, C2, talked about in the OCP as well, where that's where it shouldn't be, and bring it into the supplemental and guiding. And we will revisit this as we go through the OCP as well, because we were very cognizant of intent of the bonusing, and we wanted to keep it in line of what this was. Density bonusing will have a whole new discussion on, because there's also financial tools involved with this and everything, but this is just to clean it up, bring it in order, take it out of a zone and make it supplementary so we can use it accordingly when we look at development applications that come in.
Thank you. Any other comments, Councillor Palmer?
Just a quick comment on the definition of affordable housing dwelling unit. There's reference to the housing agreement, but that's not defined. So I was just took a look at it. So something just to take a look at whether that should be defined or not. May not be. That's it.
Okay. All right. Thanks. Any other comments? Seeing none, let's move on. Councillor Brooks, do you have a question?
No.
No? Okay. Let's move on. Thank you, staff.
Our next topic, temporary buildings and structures. Temporary building and structure is actually very similar to regulating recreational vehicle parking, things like that. This is one of those ubiquitous issues right across Western Canada, people putting up temporary structures. The current bylaw does have some provisions for temporary structures, and we're recommending to upgrade those provisions to just provide some greater clarity in regards to the provision. Regulating temporary structures, again, a lot of it has to do with neighborhood character and the impacts on neighborhood character, and also how temporary structures interact with the BC Building Code itself. So we've looked at aligning this with the code. It provides for some specificity with regards to the heights of these structures and added time limits and elements of that nature.
Any questions, discussions?
We've looked at this quite
Yeah.
intensely already.
Yeah.
So we have a temporary use permit, right? And that would allow, it's up to a 3-year and then a renewal term after that. Isn't that right? So contrary to that, it says 1 year. The bylaw, we're recommending a limit of 1 year.
So temporary use permits are a different animal. They're basically, you can have your short-term rental, for example, or your business in this area for a period of time under a temporary use permit. Temporary building is a little different. So I'm just going to ask Mr. Brooks and Ms. Wade if you want to weigh in as to the difference on that, please.
You want to tackle that one, Marianne? You would like me to attempt it?
I can talk it and you can pick up after me if you want.
Sure.
So yes, to your worship, the temporary use permit is about looking at a temporary use that wouldn't be permitted on those lands, and we would be going forward very similar to doing a rezoning, and so it's to do with use. The temporary building is a different animal. It's about talking about structures on land and what would be considered temporary to have for a period of time. Mr. Brooks?
Yeah. Thank you, Marianne. And so you can sort of the temporary buildings and structures, sort of examples of those would be, the fabric structures that get popped up, things of that nature are examples of temporary structures. And those elements that can cause bylaw enforcement issues and complaints in communities and impact neighborhood character. So I hope that helps clarify.
So Victoria Road is a prime example here. So that is a temporary structure, but we've allowed a temporary use permit for the site.
Well, it's zoned for it, so it's not temporary.
No, I'm wrong. Maybe I misunderstood. Yeah. So yeah.
Ms. Wade, you want to weigh in?
Yeah, and I'll maybe let Mr. Simon, but there's a difference there. That building is a building that's permitted and has a building permit for it, and that use is permitted there.
And just in addition to Ms. Wade, the zoning bylaw changes that we're doing where we now have a clear definition of temporary building, the description to go along with a building like the one on Victoria Road would not be referred to as a temporary building in the future to avoid the confusion now that we have clarity in the regulations that will align with the OCP, align with the building bylaw, so that there's continuity between all the bylaws and expectations for developers. Again, no temporary use permit was issued for that. The use is permitted there. It's more of a matter of the type of structure that was proposed. And in this case, if they would have tried to apply for it as a temporary building, it wouldn't have met the regulations as we're proposing. So this will rein in and set the expectations for temporary buildings in the community.
What's there now will stay because it's in place, but in the future, this is passed, that sort of thing wouldn't fit, wouldn't conform.
So that's a legal building. And
So for clarity, once this bylaw, assuming this bylaw passes, that will be a legal non-conforming at that point.
To your worship, the building itself is permitted. It has a development permit and it has a building permit. It is an industrial building, which is a permitted use in that zone. It will not be a lawful non-conforming building because it has the proper permits to operate. There's other regulations that we proposed in the industrial zone to try and address how development in the light industrial zone can pursue, but that's a separate topic from these temporary buildings that we're looking at regulating here.
So can I ask one? So is that building, he's entitled, absolutely entitled to keep that structure in that place for as long as this applies to the zone?
Mr. Simon, you want to clarify that, please?
To your worship, it is a permitted use of the zone, so the use can continue in the zone.
Yeah, okay, good. Councilor Palmer.
So I think the clarity is important, further to Councilor Elliott. So hypothetically, if that situation happened after the passing of this bylaw, that building would not have been permitted as it stands today.
To your worship and to all of council again, and I know that we've gone over this topic and it's important to have clarity. The building went through the process and was permitted in accordance with the requirements of the light industrial zone and our official community plan for the development permit area that it falls within. The evaluation after the fact, it would have potentially changed the description of the building on the permit to not be a temporary building. They would have been able to apply for the same type of structure that they've applied for. It had met building code requirements and it had met development permit requirements at that time.
So, Mayor Sulz, that's concerning to me because from my perspective, there was several loopholes that allowed that building to be built. And so I know we can't go back on history on that. So maybe we do a hypothetical situation. There's an exact kind of property today that is not built on. When the zoning gets passed, will they be able to, under those exact same number of conditions, would they be able to build that building under this zoning bylaw? Recognizing that in staff's opinion that it has conforming use. However, there was things on environmental requirements, type of materials for the construction, ideas around development permit requirements. So I think that's the clarity that we want, and the community wants to know that we won't have that situation in the future. So this hypothetical property that has a permitted use will have to be a fully constructed on all the requirements. And we've tightened up some of the loopholes because that dialogue was there. The loopholes on the temporary use versus, or temporary, not temporary use permits, but the temporary the temporary on the building, so that there was a conformity with the building bylaw and the zoning bylaw. And I'll recall that we had that dialogue that saying, okay, no, that's under the building bylaw, which has been tightened up in a time span. And that, my understanding, my memory, was built as a temporary building, not under a temporary use permit, but as a temporary building, and in staff's opinion, conforming to the use. And that was the second aspect, was getting clarity of use and as to what does that really mean. Because there was interpretation around that and what's clarity.
To your worship, one thing that I think is important to understand, because we have heard from the community, we have heard from council about the concerns respecting light industrial properties that may be in proximity to residential properties. So one of the things that we have added into this bylaw is a regulation that would actually be enforceable in our light industrial zones that would require all light manufacturing activities to be carried on within a building. So that's one way we have responded in understanding the concerns that a particular project had raised within one community, so that staff do have the tools that we can point to in the future for enforcement purposes to make sure that the nuisance issues surrounding those types of activities are managed accordingly and we have the ability to enforce it. So this will provide clarity because the building that's there, for all intents and purposes, the review process it went through was not a review process for a temporary building. It was described as such based on the description of the application that came in from the proponent. In retrospect, it could have been described as a movable building because it is designed to be put up and then taken down so that it can go to another site to serve the same function when it has appropriate zoning. But so this will provide clarification for genuine temporary buildings that are intended to be there for a year, such as a sales office, for instance, is a really good example of what would constitute a temporary building under this bylaw.
Okay. Any further comment, follow up on that, Councillor Palmer?
So maybe I could, I'm just curious, it was passed through public, our answer to the public was that it was a temporary building. Ultimately, it will be taken down.
Yep.
Right. So that was the premise. So this bylaw we're looking at says temporary buildings in the future will be limited to 1 year. Is that what I understand?
That's what's proposed.
And to your worship, what that means is if someone came in and applied for what would be called a temporary building, now that all of our bylaws are aligned, we would say, here's the regulations to govern a temporary building. If they do not comply with those regulations, then they would go through the standard review process that a permanent building would go through. If someone says, I want to construct a building, but it's only going to be here for 3 years, okay, you exceed 1 year, it's being evaluated as a permanent structure and it will go through the standard review process.
And if that proponent came and said, listen, I want to be building it would be a temporary structure for 2 or 3 years, he has the option to go to a temporary use permit.
To your worship, again, I think that we really need to clarify between use and building. Temporary use permit is for a use that is not currently prescribed in the zone. If someone's in a commercial zone and they want to undertake an industrial use, or they're in a residential zone and they want to undertake a commercial use, they can apply for a temporary use permit to facilitate that use for a prescribed period as per council's decision. A temporary building is different in the fact that it's a permitted use in the zone. They want to do a storage building, for instance, that's only needed for a year during construction. It's an industrial zone, they're allowed to have a storage building. Then we have provisions to help facilitate that temporary building. If someone wanted to propose a building and undertake a use in that building that was not permitted in the zone, then they would either need to rezone or go through a temporary use permit. So the use permit is all about the use that's being undertaken.
Right.
In Johnson Heights, we had a man camp. The buildings were temporary, but we had to go through a temporary use permit application, and we approved that.
Mr. Simon's going to weigh in.
Through your worship, that was a situation, Ms. Wade may have more to add on, but the use that they were actually looking to undertake was not permitted in the zone. And part of the reason for that is the way that the antiquated nature of the use in the RR60 zone was written out, where it referenced worker camps for BC hydro projects and railway projects, and they were looking at doing a worker camp for projects that weren't related to that use. So staff had made the interpretation, which is part of the reason why we really need to clean up this bylaw, that you are pursuing a use that is not permitted in that zone. And therefore a temporary use permit was required to facilitate that.
Yeah, maybe I misunderstood. I thought that was supposed to be an area that was designated for a man camp, or it was one of the uses that were allowed. But that was what originally was.
Yeah, RR60.
RR60 was supposed to be a temporary zone. Johnson Heights was a temporary man camp at one time, but they turned into permanent buildings. But I guess the building structure, I'm just lost on the temporary building and a temporary use permit. It's confusing.
Yeah. Councillor Palmer?
Yeah. I was hoping we wouldn't get into this conversation here, but I think our clarity is necessary. So to Councillor Elliott, the man camp, just further to Mr. Simon, that was a temporary use permit. It was non-compliant to the uses permitted upon that property. So it's different and distinct from the Victoria Street, 606 Victoria. Now, I'm going from memory of what was stated on 606, and so that we're not focusing so much on 606 Victoria. I'm in this hypothetical situation of a property that is identical in use, in zoning, proximity to the rail, environmental conditions, all that. Some hypothetical situation under this new bylaw, zoning, with the building that we see, or a building that happens to be identical to the one at 606 Victoria, could it be constructed under this new bylaw? And I think this is, and if I may, you know, one of the big things of the exercise of the zoning bylaw is clarity, simple, which we talked all about that. And so it's really important to be able to, that one I think is a pretty black and white yes or no question. I'm really trying to get it to black and white so and yes, there'll be interpretation of use and all that kind of stuff in the future, but under all the same circumstances with this bylaw, with an understanding of the same kind of use that we had there, would that building be allowed to be constructed?
To your worship and to all of council, it would not be constructed as a temporary building with the clarification that we're proposing in the bylaw. Because regulations would restrict it to a maximum of 6 meters in height and it would restrict it to a maximum of a 1-year term. So when the applicant is indicating that they're looking at having it for 2 or 3 years, then it would no longer meet the qualifications for a temporary building under the zoning bylaw or the building bylaw, which have now been updated to be aligned, or proposed to be updated rather.
So if they were going to ask to build this building permanently, it would fall under the new rules and it would be allowable.
To your worship, if it was a permitted use in the zone and they applied for the proper building permit and development permits, then they would be able to go through the process. And if council recalls, when this discussion came back to the council table, the major discussion surrounded how can we improve our supplementary and our conditions of use in the zoning bylaw for the nuisance activities that would occur? How can we improve our delegation procedures bylaw to provide more clarity on the process that these go through? How can we improve our development permit area guidelines to have more robust guidance for the form and character of commercial and industrial buildings within our commercial industrial DP area? So the zoning bylaw, again, it's on the bare bones of it. It's looking at regulating siting and, you know, the uses that can be permitted in any certain zone. And this is a case where we're providing additional clarity on what a temporary building is and what the regulations surrounding a temporary building are.
Any further follow-up?
I'm just going to make that statement because it's such an important thing. So we're getting clarity on use through the zone. So thank you for getting clarity on the different industrial zone. And so that's being addressed. The aesthetics of that building, if a shrink wrap building is acceptable as a permanent building, we've got a problem that needs to be addressed. So shrink wrap buildings should not be permitted in our community as permanent buildings. Temporary is a different thing. And we're defining that temporary, so we're getting clarity on temporary less than 1 year. So if that was a shrink wrap building for 1 year and no provision within the bylaw to extend that, I think that's been clarified. The other was loopholes, and I still have concerns about multiple loopholes regarding environmental conditions that would have triggered that particular building. For example, the requirement of a slab foundation for contamination reasons would have triggered that to go past the 100,000. It would have triggered more requirements. So I think that's important, but I don't think we want to go on and on about that. But I think that clarity, and we're doing some good things there, but I think the one message going to staff, from my perspective anyway, if that building built as it is today, as a permanent structure, then that, in my mind, is not acceptable. I don't believe it's acceptable for our community.
Okay, thank you for that comment. Any other comments regarding the temporary buildings? Seeing none, let's move on.
So the next topic is minimum lot sizes in residential zones. I'd alluded to this when we were talking about the accessory dwelling units, things of that nature. Currently, the way the zoning bylaw is written, there are minimum lot sizes provided in the zones listed without community services. What this does is it sets a minimum lot size, which is quite large. Without community services, lots are going to be quite large. But what this is it's concurrent jurisdiction. Interior health dictates any size of lot that isn't connected to community services. It's their bailiwick. They have to approve the on-site servicing. They have to approve wells and septics. And so what this does is it creates an additional level of review and approvals for the town. It also creates another additional review by the health authority. Our recommendation is to remove that and to basically just keep the minimum lot area standardized for each zone. What this would mean, for an example, is in R1, where you have your minimum lot area as 550 square meters, and without community services, 930 square meters, you'd be getting rid of the without community services. And if someone were to apply for an R1 lot that did not have community services, they would have to get approval by Interior Health anyway at time of subdivision to ensure the lot size that they could achieve. The benefit of having Island Health weigh in, or sorry, Interior Health weigh in, they have to anyway, first off. And there's a lot of provisions and a lot of new technology out there that would likely allow landowners, if they wish to, have designed on-site servicing that could actually allow for much smaller lot sizes than what was originally proposed with the without community services minimum lot areas. So it basically provides, again, it's providing greater clarity and greater flexibility in the zones by removing the provisions of minimum lot area without community services. That was long-winded. I hope it made sense.
Okay, appreciate that. Any questions or concerns? This is regarding minimum lot size residential zones. Okay, Councillor Palmer.
I think I'll pass on that, but I do have some questions in my mind on whether we want to encourage on-site treatment facilities for homes or not. I mean, that's a question for a future, the marriage. You talk about new technology and that kind of thing, but so specifically like in Narrow Heights, we have the whole sewering of that area is a big problem based on what they did a few decades ago, and it's created problems today. So anyway, that's all. That's my only comment.
All right, good. Seeing no other comments, I do have a question. We're talking about residential zones. Is there a minimum lot size or a change or anything proposed regarding commercial zones? And I'm thinking now about infill. Any comments on that?
We had not contemplated that at this time. I'm not too sure if Mr. Simon or Ms. Wade have any particular insight into the commercial or industrial.
Ms. Wade, you're muted.
Thank you, Your Worship. Thanks, Mr. Brooks. Yeah, so in regards to this one, it was really in response to what we're seeing with the ability to do duplexes on a lot of our zones and infill. And we have not addressed the issue with commercial yet. It was really to try to correct a situation that we're seeing very frequently right now, is people aren't able to do duplexes, and they are then applying to rezone their properties to R1, which is a trend we're trying to avoid in order to create infill and more intensity in housing.
Thank you. Appreciate that answer. All right, let's move along.
Thank you, Mr. Simon. So that's the end of our sort of the major content changes. But one of the things we did want to talk about is the proposed bylaw and the reasons that we're moving forward with a full repeal and replace bylaw versus a full track changes version. As you can see through our conversation, there's significant amount of amendments to the bylaw itself. If we were to follow with a track changes bylaw, you'd probably have a 500+ page document on your table right now. It'd be almost incomprehensible due to the nature of just formatting, let alone all the other changes we made to it. Due to that, we have really recommended a full repeal and replace on this bylaw because of the scope and scale of the changes themselves. And the reality is what we're doing is we're creating a foundation. The document, the zoning bylaw we have now, it creates the foundation for those future comprehensive changes, where it's going to be quite easy to provide council with a repeal and place bylaw at that time. There's a consistency in formatting throughout the entire bylaw. There's a consistency in the way definitions are used and things of that. So as we move forward with future amendments, repeal and place, our track changes will make perfect sense at this time because of the nature of all of the changes. It's almost impossible to be legible with a track changes bylaw at this time. Because of that, we provided the team has developed a summary of all the proposed amendments for council's review to ensure that council is quite aware of what we've been proposing through the overall amendments themselves. With that, I'd be happy to hand it over to Ms. Wade to summarize the next step.
I think just before we go forward, Councillor Palmer has a question.
Thank you for that overview. I think it's important, the track changes, I noted that, because I guess my skeptic is what's the little thing, the non-major thing that is major to me that I'm not going to see. So that's, I understand where you're going. I'm glad to hear that we're not going to this kind of, we're cleaning it so that we can do track changes in the future, because that's important for me, the detail. A question on editing of with a major cleanup like this. It's just inevitable. There's going to be editing things, and I think that's multifaceted. There's the planning principles, and there's the intent. There's changes that maybe have unintended consequences. Those unknown. There's going to be some known unknowns there. And then also just from a grammatical perspective, and because if you could talk to those editing processes, because I think they're important, right down to the grammatical editing, that somebody that doesn't necessarily even have a zoning background is doing a robust editing. And I know all that stuff is there's a lot of work behind all those things. But I see them as important to mitigate any sort of little errors that we might, or big errors that we might have in the future.
I'll attempt to answer the question and let me know if I hit the mark or not. When we're going through a process of this nature, where you have a bylaw that's as fundamentally fractured as the existing bylaw that you have now, the initial process we go through is going through that bylaw front to back to go, okay, what is consistent, what isn't consistent? And we prefer to find out what that stuff that's consistent. From there, it all comes down, and Mr. Simon made this comment earlier. The most important element of any zoning bylaw is your definition section. Without a good definition section, you cannot interpret how the bylaw is supposed to work. It's all about, zoning's all about use, and then you have your setbacks in that too, but it's all about use. So we look at it for consistency, we look at it for unlawful delegation, we look at it for references that are not legally valid anymore, and then we look at your definition section to ensure that the definitions are modernized, are understandable, and then you go through and you look at every listed permitted use in the entire zoning bylaw. And so I think there is 300 or 400 permitted uses in the existing. You go through that and go, okay, are there consistent uses? Are there uses with no definitions? And so we go through every one of them one by one to make sure and tie it to a key definition. And that's why you see all of the proposed definitions as part of the housekeeping amendment. So we go through those, and what we do is when we're looking at those definitions, we're looking at definitions that are used in a manner that is consistent throughout other jurisdictions, so that for that ease of interpretation, right? So people can go, okay, what is this definition? Let's use manufacturer or light industrial or something like that, you know, to ensure that there's some consistency with what the definition for your community may need to be tweaked a bit, but general consistency. So that's sort of the first blush of how we tackle a bylaw itself. The second blush is once we've cleaned that up, what we do is we have a team of people that actually then read the bylaw from front to back for those grammatical components. Does it make sense? Does it not make sense? Is there a lot of jargon? We should try to remove as much jargon as possible out of any kind of bylaw, whether it's OCP or zoning bylaw. So we go through, we remove jargon, we clean things out of that nature. Again, the entire intent is to make that bylaw as legible as possible. The reality is it's still a regulatory bylaw. And so regulatory bylaws have to have regulatory language. And so we try to make it as accessible as possible while still meeting the needs of a regulatory bylaw for interpretation and enforcement purposes. So did that answer part of it at least?
Yeah, definitely. That's I have that understanding. And I'm just wondering if there's some merit of having just a pure grammatical, non-planning review of the document, just for clarity of grammar and the structure, because that's the intent. And that might not be a normal step, but I'm wondering if there might be some benefit to sending it out to someone, an expert in editing, not necessarily planning documents, but just the grammatical aspects of it.
So perhaps if I could just step in, Mr. Brooks?
Of course.
Councillor Palmer, just there's other things that have happened here. This has also been reviewed by our legal counsel for those sorts of things, as well as alignment with the OCP. And our corporate services also looks at these from that process as well, from the grammatical and the editorial. So as a team, we're all working together and all have had our eyes on this. So we've had legal, we've had the whole planning team on it, and corporate is on it as well. So we probably have at least 10 people that have reviewed this for those things. So I feel fairly comfortable that between corporate, legal, and our consultants and the planning staff that we've been able to review that. So I feel quite comfortable with where we're at right now.
Any further comments or questions?
Could I, on a personal level, I've experienced some trouble, not trouble, but my experience with the zoning. I have an R3 zone property, and that allowed you to build a single home duplex, up to a fourplex in that zone. And what I did was I built I built a duplex on an R3 lot. But the setback rule had I built a single home, the setbacks that were applied to the building were R3 requirements. The building, so basically effectively the land space was underutilized. So I built a small building on a zone lot that was allowed a bigger building or multiple units on it. I just wonder, will that be addressed in the update? Can we build flexibility into the zoning? So if you build something less than what the zoning would allow, would you be basically you won't be hampered by the setbacks that are applied to a bigger building?
If I may, yeah, before the answer. So I'm going to try and answer just for clarity of my understanding whether I get it right or not. So the answer is, if you want the zoning to change, you'll have to apply for rezoning as it applies to setbacks.
So now I'm going to go to staff to answer that question.
And tell me,
Mr. Brooks, do you want to weigh in first, please?
Certainly, through your worship. So yeah, that is one option. You can apply for variance, you can apply for rezoning for your setbacks, things of that nature. It's a slippery slope to take a multifamily zone and create what you call nested zoning. It causes a ton of issues. So what nested zoning is a zone that says, okay, this is a zone for multifamily residential, but will allow you to do single family residential also. The reason that's a slippery slope is because it erodes your multifamily zoned properties in your community. Multifamily zoned properties help promote housing diversity. By putting single family home as a permitted use in a multifamily zone, what you're doing is you're eroding that, because what you'll see is almost everybody will build a single family home on it, and therefore you no longer have any multifamily zone property in the community. And so I strongly actually recommend against created nested zoning of that nature, because it will, if it's not causing you issues now, it will certainly cause you issues in the future.
Should have built multifamily.
Oh, I should have. I know I should have. I know. Oh.
All right. What it should have, could have. All right, let's move on. Thank you.
All right. Thank you.
Just before you carry on this way, I just took a washroom break, but some of my council would like to do that. So we can just take a moment here and then we'll get right back at it. My apologies.
Okay.
Are we on, Gary? or-
Yeah, it's still being recorded.
Yeah, I just didn't mean to. I just was limited from experience with how the setbacks was done.
We can hear you.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Thank you. Appreciate that.
Well, I think this is exciting. Hopefully we'll get all resolved and allow some exciting things to happen this year.
Yeah.
So they're putting up some new nets on through that again, you heard, or?
Yes, they are. I have heard. I asked the question this past week with the minister meeting, so yeah, they're definitely working on some new netting and cleaning up the netting, some trees and stuff.
Oh, so yeah, so if I get drive by, I mean, on some land and not there's a lot of rock on the road.
I think we were talking 1,000 cubic meters or something. Never good. All right.
So what was
Just so you're aware, we're still being
Yeah,
recorded.
we're still on.
okay.
You're still on audio for the whole world to hear? How are you doing?
Pardon me?
I said we're on audio for the whole world to see. Sorry, but how are you doing?
Yeah, I'm okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's okay.
Way busy, I guess, a couple days ago.
Yeah, busy.
First meeting in October. However, I might be able to come in virtually. Guarantee it. And then we have one more council meeting this office. So I'm also away during. But I'm away the last week in September. I don't believe. You know what? I leave on Tuesday, so I may or may not be able to be there.
So the 28th is our next council meeting.
Yeah, so I'm on the road, and I'm not sure that I'll be able to make it. And then the meeting after that, I think I have a conflict as well, but because I'll be out of province, but I think I'll be able to tag in through the Zoom or whatever.
Okay, we're going to get back at it. Thank you for your patience, staff. So if we can move forward on the agenda where we're at this point, Ms. Wade.
Thank you, Your Worship. I would just summarize that where we are now is that after today's workshop, staff we'll take the comments away. We'll certainly diarize that. We can provide that back to council. I think generally what I've heard is we're generally moving in the right direction, and that what staff would be proposed to do now is to bring forward first and second and reading of this minor update for council's consideration and a setting of a public hearing. Once we get through this phase and we get through the OCP, then we will be coming back and updating the zoning bylaw with the information we have from our master plans, our OCP process, and our housing action plan, and then moving forward section by section in the zoning bylaw, starting with residential, commercial. So we'll go through it in a very methodical manner with all the information and with the comments that council has provided to us. So basically, we would then, and they're outlined on the slide for you in your report, the phases we talked about. But I really want to thank council today for their time to go through all this and all their comments. I hope it's been as helpful to you as it has been for staff and our consultants. And hope this has been a good process for council so we can move forward with a very important document so we can clean up a lot of the problems we have with conflicts and clarity and implementation. And of course, in planning, you can always improve something. Nothing is ever 100% perfect. And we will just keep on evolving and keep on moving forward. So thank you for your time today. And if you have any questions.
Thank you. Any comments from council? Councilor Palmer?
Yeah, and thanks to staff, Director Wade and Mr. Simon and Mr. Brooks. Thank you for the work and for taking us through. It was helpful for me for understanding, and I feel better after this session that we're ready to move ahead. Sort of contradicting my reticence at the beginning of the meeting, so look forward to having that come forward at council. And I'll attempt to do one more edit for you.
Yep. Anyway, Mr. Brooks, thank you for your time. I appreciate you doing the consulting and working through this. Mr. Simon, Ms. Wade, appreciate your input. Thank you all, and we're now going to move on to departmental updates. So Ms. Floyd will go through item 10A, single-use plastics bylaw update. Do you have something for us that we can use? Thank you.
Sure, Your Worship. So basically, I just want to give you a verbal update. We gave first reading to the single-use plastics bylaw on April 27th, and we have since uploaded all of the information onto the Talk Revelstoke page. As we've heard from a few councillors and members of the community, there is some fatigue in terms of public engagement opportunities. We didn't want to go through and push this through the chamber and the local businesses with this last phase of COVID and all of the changes. However, having said that, we're ready to push out more information if council so chooses. We can hold back if you think that might, that the fatigue might affect the engagement that actually happens. But our executive assistant will coordinate all of the public engagement and reach out to the chamber and the local businesses to find out what they would like to see and if the bylaw that we've proposed so far is acceptable.
Comments, councillors? Councillor Elliott, I'm going to come to you first.
Please, it's gone to the chamber twice. And well, I think several years ago they agreed to it. I think it went, when it first came up in my term, or renewed in my term, it went out again to the chamber, and they again felt they could stomach it. You know, it is an adjustment. The plastic bag is, it's not the actual environmental impact that it will make that's important. It's just the message that we should be thinking different. Plastic is not good. Let's do whatever we can, but it should apply in all aspects of our lives. Let's go about reducing, and that should be the message. So I think we're ready for it. Maybe something beyond COVID and beyond politics. This is a simple win. Let's take it and go.
All right, Councillor Palmer, any comment?
Yeah, thank you. So to the staff, there was a resolution at UBCM today on single-use plastics. I think it's just supportive of where we're going. Might be worthwhile taking a look at that, but it was essentially giving communities more empowerment in this area. I think the main point from that is this is resonating with many communities in the province. I can't remember, there were so many resolutions today, but it's probably worth just taking a quick look at what that resolution was and maybe supportive of where we're going with this.
Yeah, I'll have a look in the morning. And Minister of Municipal Affairs stated in her address day before yesterday that definitely they were allowing communities to do their own single-use bans and deal with that. So I think we're ready to move forward. If you want to move this forward, Councillor Ron.
I was just going to say I'll make the motion to
Okay.
grant to council, I guess, because it has to come from here, right?
So at what's this stage? Do we need to go to council first, or do we need to go out to the community one last time, or what's the appropriate measure here, Ms. Floyd?
Your Worship, so it's already gone to council and received first reading.
Okay.
The discussion around that was that we would bring it to the business community to make sure they were still in support of it because they have so many other things on their plates with COVID. And we were going to gradually bring it into play. So I personally think that, yes, the chamber probably already has been engaged on this, but it's a new board, new members at different times. So I think it's really important to reach out to them. I know I spoke to Stacey before it was given first reading, and she was supportive, but again, wanted to have more of a robust conversation with her members.
So then I think from our perspective, let's reach out to them, let them have one more kick at it, and then let's move forward. Councillor Charlotte, you have a comment?
Yes, thank you, Worship. I agree on both sides of this. I think the timing, we've talked about this. We have lots of support. There's support from the province. We should be able to move forward smoothly and quickly and efficiently with this. But I also agree that it's worth going back to the Chamber of Commerce just briefly to double check that there's no concerns with the timing or the implementation schedule because they didn't have the full details at the time. We only had the concept and the ideas. This is the actual bylaw. This is the written. Now, that being said, I'm also comfortable bringing it forward for a second reading and going to them as part of the public hearing process. Because as far as I'm understanding, we still have to go through the public hearing process before we can do third reading and adopt. Is that correct?
It needs to go to the inspector of municipalities for approval. At this stage, I know that I wasn't aware that the minister made a statement today. That may have been scaled back because they were hoping that municipalities would wait so that it wouldn't get caught up with needing that approval.
Right.
So we may just be able to bring it forward for second reading.
So this one, I think what Councillor Palmer was talking about today was that UBCM endorsed that we would be allowed to move this forward. Is that not correct? Isn't that what we said?
I believe so.
Yeah, and so I think the minister has basically said it's up to the individual communities moving things forward. I'm sure the ministry will approve it, but definitely we have to follow the same steps that we normally do. So I'm gonna go to Councillor Brooks Hill and then Councillor Palmer, and then I'll come back. Councillor Charlotte, are you finished, or you didn't want to?
No, just if I can have one quick follow-up then.
Okay.
If it does have to go to ministerial approval before we can take it for second reading, then does that have to be in that? Would we be able to make adjustments after that approval, or would it have to go back for further approval if we made adjustments? So say, for example, the only thing I could really see coming back from the business community is the tweaks to the timing or different details, not the fundamental meat of the bylaw. And I'm just wondering, is that part of the concern with getting more feedback before we go for ministerial approval?
So, Councillor Charlotte, no, we would actually give it for a second and third reading before it went to the minister for approval. So there is no public hearing required. We just wanted to make sure that before it went to the minister that we had all of the public comment and the business comments so that we didn't have to amend it after the fact.
Wonderful. Thank you for the clarity. So, Your Worship, the concern I have, if there's no public hearing required, that's actually kind of quite of a relief. I think we have enough public hearings on our docket this fall, but I think just a quick pass through with the Chamber of Commerce would be welcome. I know the business community is looking to engage with the city and to make sure that we have a functional relationship that's going back and forth, not in the sense of slowing things down, but in the sense of making sure we go forward right.
Appreciate the comment. Councillor Brooks.
I'd be happy to see it at the next council meeting for second reading. At that point, it can go to the chamber. Maybe the media will pick up on it and people will get engaged with it. And in terms of the timing with COVID, then even when we pass it, it's all about when it's actually implemented, when that date is. And as we move forwards and, COVID restrictions, etc., are changing every week. So we won't know when a good time is. We'll have a better idea once we're doing third reading, basically.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Palmer.
So I believe Councillor Ryan made a motion. I'm not sure.
Yeah, I'll make a motion. I don't think I formally did, but to do second reading at next council meeting.
So I'll second that amendment.
Okay. And all those in favor?
So can I just speak to it? So I think it's important to, we're anxious to get this thing moving ahead. You met with Councillor Elliott. Also, the Chamber of Commerce is not meeting in September. The next meeting is October 20th, and late in the afternoon. So it's just if we're waiting for all these referral things, it's just gonna drag out.
Well, they can do some sort of email poll, I think, and do that. So I think we'll encourage that. Okay. Any further comments? Moving this to second reading into council.
I'm all in favor of. I just think it's been bandied about for far too long. 3 years. We've been talking about banning a plastic bag. First, we couldn't do it because the province wasn't approved federally. And now the province is adhering. We had that for a year that we were allowed to go after a plastic bag ban. And then COVID and all these things continue to delay us. I say, this is just a message point. We need to go on a media blitz, change the way we handle or what we packaging and reduce. And that's what we want to get out of this. The messaging can start now. Going to a second reading and waiting 2 months for a chamber, they've already given the consent twice. And I think the community, and it was supposed to go to the environmental committee, and we've got nothing. So let's do something about it. Let's stop the talk.
Okay, so the motion on the table is to move it to second reading in council. Are you in favor?
I'm fully in favor. But
Everyone in favor? Approved. Motion's carried. Thank you. All right. Going to move on to development services, community amenity contributions. So, Ms. Wade, you have some input on that.
Yes, Your Worship. Yes, we'll be following up. We're having a part 2 of our development financing workshop, and this will be in the part 2. And we're scheduling that for the next committee of the whole, which is October 14th. So we hope to be back with Nancy Henderson, and we'll be talking about it then.
All right, thank you. Appreciate that. Any comments, Councillor Ryan?
Yeah. So in that workshop, we'll talk about how it can be applied. Is it a workshop in that it will be collaborative? Is there any input that you guys are seeking? Or is it just to explain what the tool is?
Through your worship, the Council Ryan will be run similarly like we did last time with the DCCs. When we came forward with the part 1 of the development finance tool. So yes, we hope to stop and have comments and a discussion.
Okay, and then in terms of the timeline, so this is a requirement in order for us to implement CACs? I guess
So,
my question is that we were hoping to have this tool available to development services. So I'm wondering what is stopping us from using them? That was the update that I was hoping to get.
okay, I didn't quite get the clarity of that. So the point of the part 2 workshop is to walk through what CACs are, how they can be used, and we have to have a conversation with council on what tools you would like to use going forward. So that was the point of the part 2 development finance.
Okay, once that's determined, how long would it be to implement those?
There's a series of steps that will have to go in there, and we can outline those steps to you. Once council makes a decision, then we could go through that.
Okay.
But it's not just an overnight. They're pretty hefty bylaws or policies.
Yeah, I guess my concern is just like, I don't have a ton of clarity on what that process looks like, and we passed that motion like 2 years ago. So if at this workshop we could have an idea of timelines, that would be helpful.
Through your worship to Councillor Ryan, yes, but we need to talk about the components of it and where the tolerance level is for how we would apply that, and is it the best tool to use?
Okay.
All right, thank you. Any other comments, questions? Seeing none, thank you, Ms. Wade. Appreciate that input. We're going to move on to item 10C, budget items, Bear Smart garbage collection. So we've got Ms. McCabe is here. You're up.
So as far as the Bear Smart garbage collection, I do know that Mr. Black has got a report that he is on organics and the collections of them and the management of them that is coming to, I believe, Committee of the Whole. And so I know the report's being drafted. We've had some review of I've reviewed the financial numbers within it. And so that will come to council. And at that time, it will be the impact on the garbage fees will be outlined as well for the various different options. So there are quite a few different options. And so, yes, that report is in the works from my discussions with Mr. Black. And so I'm not sure when he's planning on bringing it forward, but I do know he is intending to do it sooner rather than later. My understanding is this fall. So I don't know if that's October or November, but it is coming forward.
Councilor.
Yep.
So just to better understand this for my sake, the report will talk about the various options that are available to us to retrofit the garbage pickup solution so that it's bear smart, and then council decide, we don't need to make this decision for however many years because the trucks, we're not going to replace it right now, but when we do, it's going to cost us however much, and then that gets put into the long-term budget?
Yes, correct.
Okay, so right now, are we allowing any, even if it's a real ballpark figure in the long-term budget, acknowledging that it's going to cost us more than we have?
No, it's not in the long-term budget at this time because the numbers weren't known when the last financial plan was done. And so since then, Mr. Black and his department have come up with the numbers, and so they will be incorporated, depending on which option council chooses, obviously, into the next round of the update for the financial plan.
Right, okay, so before the end of our term, we'll be able to. Great, thanks.
Yes. The next one is about, if I can just go on, Worship. The next one's about the visitor rates at the community center. And again, I've spoken with Ms. Donato on this one, and I do know that she's got a report again, I believe, discussion paper coming forward to committee of the whole in October that outlines the research that she's done on this from other communities and what approaches, why they've done it, where they've done it, and those kind of details. And so she'll be bringing that forward. At that time, if there's whatever decisions are made by council, well, by committee, we will then incorporate those as well into the next update of the financial plan. Any questions?
Thank you. Moving on.
And then the last one, council remuneration. Yes, I've been working on that. There's actually some great tools for me for access to what other municipalities pay. It's great. And so I will be working that in. My understanding is that council is not looking for me to propose a wage increase or remuneration increase for the current council, but that is to go into the 2023 year, but it will be part of the budget process for the next year. So it's not going to be in the first year, it would be in the next year and forward. And so that was the approach I was taking. If that's not correct, I'm happy to take guidance on how to adjust it. But yes, it is in the works.
That's basically my understanding, but there would, in theory, be a new council for the end of 2022, so it should.
Fair enough. Yes.
March the budget for 2022.
Yes. So there'd be 2 months in 2022. That's correct. Thank you.
All right. Any further questions, comments on that?
So we're setting it up for the next council to start, but my worry is that we should do it at the start. Right?
Yeah, that's what we're talking about.
Yeah, when they start in November or October, they should be walking into a new.
Yeah, that's what Mike was just asking about.
Okay.
Yep, that's good. Okay, I have nothing further, so I'm going to, Councilor Palmer, do you have something else? Councilor Sherlock, sorry, I didn't see your hand up, my apologies. Go ahead, Nicole.
Yeah, thank you, Your Worship. And just to echo the concerns of my fellow councillors is that, it would be nice to have it rolled in a way that it's already a said and done thing. And I'm also curious about maybe the possibilities of having a couple of options of how that would look. I think part of the concern in the previous instance this was brought forward was the impact on taxation and how it was going to potentially be a big bump. So depending on where we decide that it's best to have future councils at, is just what options do we have to make it less of an impact on taxation so it's not sudden for the residents either. Because I did appreciate that it was phased in, but I also don't want any opportunity for it to be phased out.
Fair enough. Point noted.
Councilor Palmer.
Thank you, Mayor Sulz, and thank you for your patience. So I was not part of this discussion earlier. I'm a product of the discussion. And there was my comments are new. So I fully concur that this should be for the next council, not for this council, and I think there's general agreement on that. The other question that rose before that I think is ideal is that there would be a committee. I'm not trying to bog this down, but there would be a committee that would review the numbers and provide recommendations. I have talked to some people in the community. It's just something to think about, but that way there is recommendations coming from that. Now, I believe Tanya will have good numbers that any rational person should be able to take a look at and say, okay, what's reasonable or consistent with the rest of the province. However, I think we should give some consideration whether it should be a small review committee, 3 people or something. That's the approach some councils take. The last point on it is, again, at UBCM, they were talking about maternity leave. So I think that should be added in there. I'm astounded that it's even a question in our society today. Like even at UBCM, it's like a 60-40 split on the vote. 40% of the attendants at UBCM were not supportive of maternity leave. Like I just couldn't believe it. But there is provision for local governments, and I think that should be entrenched in here in the absence of any kind of other legislation that I think it's intuitively obvious anyways. So those are just my comments.
Great. Mr. Matucci, you've turned your camera on, so do you need to weigh in or would like to weigh in?
Thank you, Your Worship. No, if council's interested in looking at committee, I know Kelowna has used a committee in the past. I could get a terms of reference and forward it to Cindy and Tanya, for council to look at an example of how it's done. And it's 3 members, I think it was 3 members of the community representing different segments of the community that a person like Tanya or the corporate officer would work with and do their background research or anything that the committee might want that would help them make a decision, and that they would make a recommendation. So, Councillor, you are correct. Different communities use different ways of dealing with this. So if council would like that, I could certainly go and get the terms of reference for council to peruse before going too far.
Great, appreciate that. Councillor Charlotte, you have your hand up.
Thank you, Your Worship. Yeah, and this kind of brings up another question that I remember when we first were elected and there was conversations around extended benefits. And we needed to have 3 councillors on board to be able to get those extended benefits for us. I'm curious as to whether that committee could also look at not just the remuneration of council, but what are the other benefits that would achieve the goal, which is to have diverse representation and to make it more enticing, not that it's a profitable thing to run for to get this office, that you're not getting a great paying job, but it makes it a sustainable job for different segments of our society to be able to join. So whether that's maternity leave, whether that's childcare provisions, whether that's extended benefits, whatever that looks like. And I think that if we had a committee that was diverse and did represent the community in that sense, that maybe we might get some interesting answers out of that for a long-term plan, not necessarily right away.
Okay, any other comments, councillors? Councillor Brooks?
Just maybe make a motion to explore the possibility of setting up a committee.
We need to make a motion from our committee of the whole to move forward by setting up a committee, Mr. Matucci. How do you feel?
Your Worship, what I could do is I could just get that information and provide it to council, and then council could determine after if they want it. I'm sure Cindy will say you need a motion, but I could provide that information as a resource that could help you. So at the next time you're at a council meeting, you could then make the motion if it's something you want to do.
I'll second Councillor Brooks' Hill motion to have staff bring a term of reference for a committee at the next council meeting.
Okay.
You want to talk second? Yeah. I mean, we have endless committees, and I'm just wondering whether we're afraid to make a decision. And we just pass it off to another, let's get another group together. We can review it as a finance committee if it makes sense. We're paid to make rational choices here. we're not paid very much, so maybe that's as simple as we should make it right now. Just have a
Well,
discussion.
I think having a committee of members of the community is the appropriate way to go, and I think that's what Councillor Palmer is trying to allude to.
If we were talking more than minimum wage, I would say we probably need a committee, but we're not. So let's not be afraid to make decisions. That's all I'm
I
saying.
don't think any of us are afraid to make decisions,
Good.
but I think the prudent choice of this would be to get others involved. So there is that motion on the table, correct?
Right.
All right. All those in favor in bringing that forward to a committee?
So can I speak to the motion?
Yes, sure. Go ahead.
So the reason for this, unlike other committees, is getting a recommendation. There's a perception in the community, and I think it's valid, as to whether we should be voting for wages. Yes, it's not in our term, but it's still there. There's a good potential that some of us are going to be beneficiaries of that. And I think it's a level of public scrutiny that's warranted. This is a committee that will meet, look at the data that staff brings them, and make a recommendation, and that committee will be dissolved just like that.
So we're having a difficult time, if I could respond.
Yeah.
I think we're just having a difficult time getting active and engaged committee members. And it's just another thing that we've got to get up and organize. And I'm saying, we're just.
Yeah, I don't think you have any problem having 2 or 3 people come together talking about wages for.
Well, if there were significant wages, then I agree. But I think we're not bankrupting anybody.
Okay.
Yeah, I agree with Rob. I think it's a waste of time. It's just.
All right, so I'll ask the question again. All those in favor? Opposed? So note that Councillor Ryan, Councillor Elliott are opposed, and the rest of us are in favor.
Okay, fair enough.
Thanks.
What?
All right, so now I'm going to ask for termination of the meeting. Councillor Elliott, Councillor Brooks Hill, all in favor? Motion carried, meeting's terminated. Thank you all, appreciate your time.
Anyway.